Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will post to our website next week. Today, we're happy to welcome Dr. Evangeline or Van Linkous, Program Director and Associate Professor in Urban and Regional Planning at the University of South Florida. Van's work focuses on the fiscal and legal tools that shape land use in rapidly evolving communities, and her research has appeared in leading planning journals. A Fulbright U.S. scholar and award-winning educator, Van also contributes her expertise through service on statewide planning organizations and as a planning commissioner in Hillsborough County. After Dr. Linkous's presentation, we will have a Q&A session, so feel free to drop any questions into the chat and we will address them at the end. Van, you may begin.
All right. Okay, how does this look? Is it showing up correctly?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. And we were talking just at the beginning of this. I usually use Teams, so I'm a little less certain with Zoom, but it seems like everything's working. So thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate the interest in this topic. Again, I'm Van Linkous. I'm the program director and an associate professor in the urban planning program at the University of South Florida. So I'm here today to talk about transfer of development rights. And that topic is really the subject of my academic career in many ways. Most of my research does look at uh, comprehensive planning, land use planning, and then there's a particular lens where I've looked at Florida specific issues and looked specifically at transfer of development rights. So most recently, I have had the great fortune of having a partnership with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Foundation, who invited me to do an updated study on some of my original transfer of development rights work that I published about a decade ago. So I'm currently in the process of working to finalize the reporting I've done for them that kind of updates work I did 10 years ago. So a lot of this that I'll be talking about today is this kind of long-term view of what transferable development rights in Florida have looked like and meant and the outcomes of those programs. And then I'm going to highlight some of this research that is actually, you're the first one seeing it today, because I will be turning in the Fish and Wildlife Foundation final report on Friday, and you're going to get a preview of what some of that research looks like. What else do I want to say as by way of intro? I think I'm just going to kind of jump to the punchline. Although I'm asked to also present a great deal around research on transferable development rights, I do think a lot of my research points to some challenges with these programs, and you're going to see that today. The specific lens of the work that I'm doing for Fish and Wildlife Foundation had to do with how this tool interacts with conservation and land conservation. So that's also going to be a focus. Let me get into it. So I'm starting with kind of TDR 101. For those of you who are not familiar with the tool of transferable development rights, it's a pretty widely used tool. It's used by over 239 communities in the US. That comes from a national publication that kind of did a scan, but I would argue it's probably much more than that because I know that there are, at least 60 in the state of Florida alone. So I'd say it's probably way more widely used than that statistic. It is used and also widely recommended for a wide range of purposes. So coastal management, affordable housing, historic preservation. My research tends to look at it in the context of growth management, open space, and land conservation. So in Florida, that tends to be at that county level scale, but these can be used in highly localized or urban solutions. These can be used at a broader kind of regional planning scale. The most famous regional TDR programs are in Pinelands, New Jersey, and that protects the aquifer in that region that serves the kind of greater New York area, and also Lake Tahoe, if any of you are familiar with those programs. So these come at a wide range of scales, serve a wide range of purposes, and that popularity, their wide recommendation, their wide adoption reflects the fact that they kind of embrace the shift in land use planning that I think is kind of a late 90s, early 2000s shift away from publicly funded regulatory approaches to planning and towards incentive-driven entrepreneurial placemaking. So in the planning literature, you're going to see a lot of recommendations to use TDR, and you're going to see a lot of focus on the performance of successful TDR programs. And I, I hate that sometimes I feel like my research is a little bit of a downer because I'm going to give you my frank evaluation of TDR strengths and weaknesses. As someone who studied this tool for a couple of decades, I've got mixed feelings about this tool, and I try, my work as a researcher is to look at the science behind this, to present fact-based solutions. And so I am going to have that sort of sad sometimes perspective on TDR, but I hope by affirming kind of where TDR really does work, what it really can do, that people can use this tool in the most effective way. Because I think is what I'm trying to make the point on this slide is you're going to see TDR recommended in a great deal of places, and you're going to see a lot of numbers that suggest that TDR works really well. My research kind of says that that's not the whole picture. There's a lot to this story. So a little more on what is TDR, or transferable development rights. So basically, I like the image here that kind of shows an open space situation, maybe a farm type situation. Oh, excuse me. If you, if there's a plan and land development code that supports agricultural or rural kind of uses in some places, and the policy perspective is to keep those places in open space, in agricultural lands. Transferable development rights allows for the transfer of that right to develop, which is one of the bundle of rights, as is depicted on this picture here, in property ownership. And that kind of lets you kind of move it across the playing field of a community and perhaps move it into a place that's more appropriate for development. So it's kind of this tool that sort of theoretically and in fact, I guess, lets you sever and separate just that one right, that right to develop your property, and move it. And it's so the place where you want to move it away from, the open space, the agricultural land, the historic property, whatever that might be, depending on that community's policy, that's called a sending area. So there are sending area landowners, if they want to sell that right to develop, leave their land in agricultural use or conservation use, then they can sell that right to develop their land theoretically to someone in a place that's appropriate to develop in, like a developer who wants to develop in, typically kind of, we think of it being like in the downtown, like shown in this picture, where there's some skyscrapers where one more unit of typically a residential unit, there's an economic incentive for them to want to build that, for them to buy that development right, and to be able to sell that additional development right. So what does this do? It redistributes development rights across the place and kind of can rationalize the vision that communities might have about where they want to have more development, like urban spaces, and where they want to have less development, like for agriculture and open space. And it offsets property rights restrictions. So, to the degree that are places that are rural, agricultural, or ecologically sensitive might have a lot of restrictions about, you can't develop on wetlands, you can't develop at quite high of densities, etc., then that can be offset if those folks can kind of sever that right to develop and sell that to someone else. They get an economic kind of benefit there. And then this also leverages private dollars for resource protection because you're achieving those open space, those agricultural area, those rural area protections. And the way this works in theory, that developer is incentivized to pay for those protections and purchase those development rights, and they get an incentive to build at a higher rate in their receiving area. So that's TDR 101. There's a famous article that was published. It's getting to feel a little bit dated. It was 2008, and it kind of looked at the top 20 US TDR programs. This was in the Journal of the American Planning Association. And here you can see what these look like. And so this is kind of when I did some original research, when I first came into academia and began to study this topic. I was looking at this kind of data, and this was kind of the status quo of what national TDR programs were doing. So a couple of things I want to call your attention to. So in spite of TDR being really widely recommended, I think if any of you have ever seen this tool, it's kind of presented as this panacea for big open space protections. But there are only 7 programs on this list that have more than 10,000 acres protected. So I think that's kind of, if I can kind of impart one of my most important lessons about TDR, it does work. There are programs that have outcomes, but expectations should be managed. These are not going to have sweeping landscape level preservation outcomes necessarily. In a few places they do indeed, and they work really well in those places. But there are reasons, and that's kind of what my research points to, why it doesn't always work out that way. So what else is interesting and important about here? Your number two program, the Pinelands, New Jersey, that's got a national level of conservation protections associated with that because of that aquifer system that's underlying those lands. That's a regional program that has a national framework that makes it extremely regulatory, has a regulatory enhancement that not a lot of programs have access to. 5 of these programs are in Maryland. They really reflect kind of this unique Maryland dynamic where there's a commitment and a history around agriculture, which we do have in Florida as well. And then also there's an interest in kind of large um, urban spaces as well that are highly incentivized in communities. And then finally, we have 5 in Florida. So this is why, as a native Floridian, for the most part, my family moved here when I was little. I'm so as someone who's committed their life to studying Florida and planning and why we are what we are here in Florida in terms of the built environment. I was really interested in the fact that, hey, why are we doing so much of this in Florida? What does this mean? How does this affect Florida as a policy framework? So that's really where the rest of this presentation today is going to build on. What are we doing around TDR in Florida? And if you'll notice, we've got even quite a few Florida programs that are in this top set in the nation in terms of acreage preserved through TDR. So let's see. Before I jump into Florida, I'm going to go just talk about King County. This is the most successful TDR program in the country. And this is essentially Greater Seattle. So they've got rural areas that are the designated sending lands. And this is kind of a lot of forestry lands, agricultural lands in the far hinterlands of the Greater Seattle area. And then they've got a couple different urban zones, the primary one being the city of Seattle, where there's an enormous interest in high density development, huge demand for it, huge return on investment for folks who can do that kind of product in that marketplace. And they have protected over 145,600 acres. Every time I go back about once a year and I'm updating this research, that number goes up a good amount. They have tremendous ongoing continuous outcomes here in this program. So I definitely, although I am going to point to some of the limitations around transferable development rights in Florida, I just want to be clear, it can work. It can work really well. There's some important things to understand about this program too, though. It was jump started with an appropriation of 1.5 million TDRs. Excuse me, I am just getting over a cold, so hopefully my voice will keep up. So originally there was public investment to purchase a lot of the open space. Then those development rights from those open space, that open space that was purchased in sending area lands were kind of severed and banked, and then they could be resold to the development community. So there's a big public investment that made this program kickstart. Developers can readily purchase those banked credits in this program, and that makes it really easy to participate in. When they purchase those credits, a revolving fund happens, so that kind of gives them money to kind of manage the protected lands where there's an easement on those sending lands. Once those development rights are sold, they can kind of continuously kind of refuel and fund program activities. And then also important in this program is there's intergovernmental coordination. This is happening with City of Seattle, the county level, and a lot of the local governments that are in this region. So absolute success story, but a very unique circumstance. This is a slide I'm not going to go into too deep into the woods on this one, but like this is the design features that are typically thought to go into transferable development rights. There's a lot of factors that can go into it. Basically, I'm going to focus on kind of, you've got to make sure people understand what the program does, and these programs can be very complicated, so simplicity can really help on these. You've got to align them with market conditions. You've got to make sure that there's really an incentive for folks to participate. So in a lot of Florida communities, I think one of the big challenges is that developers can usually achieve their development goals by right. There's not a lot of demand in a lot of our communities for high density development. In particular, I study county level TDR programs. So when you think about that county level scale, there is demand for high density development in a lot of our core downtown areas that are in cities, but that's less true typically at the county scale. So that becomes really important in looking at why TDR works the way it does in Florida. So really, it's got to have a good, simple program design. It's got to have community support, long, ongoing, strong support for things like land preservation activities, and it's got to be aligned well with the market. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to my original research contributions. So here, when I wrote original research, I actually mean the research I did and published about a decade ago. And then in the next part of this presentation, I'll move into the current work I'm doing that updates kind of decades ago research that's been funded by Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. So the primary finding in my original research, which was published in 2014 in the Journal of the American Planning Association with Tim Chapin, who is a researcher and dean at Florida State University, we basically looked at the fact that there are 3 different approaches to TDR in Florida, and that these align with state growth management policy contexts. So I'm sorry that there is a lot of information on this slide, and I do have my email at the end of this if this relates to a publication, and I'm happy to share my work with you if you want to kind of get more in the weeds on this. But basically, early conventional TDR programs, those work kind of the way you imagine it, the way that slides I showed you in the beginning here worked, where you've got some open space, some rural lands, and you want to move, those are your sending areas, and then they are moved into receiving areas in urban spaces. So sending from rural, receiving in a urban. At the time when those programs were created, Florida had strong growth management protections and rules at the state level that really promoted there being limits on sprawl, promoting density in urban areas, and restricted growth in rural areas. More traditional kind of planning 101 concepts. When you get to the hybrid period, you begin to see TDR programs, and I'll just bring attention to that locational features column here, where your sending areas were those rural areas, as in the conventional programs, but your receiving areas were at the rural urban fringe. So these were the places where the home builders kind of like to build, where there is a big market for them, where there are green spaces that make it easy to kind of enable large scale developments. So I think Florida local governments, counties were being very innovative and entrepreneurial in tapping into what that was happening in the marketplace there, coming up with these market oriented strategies that had roots in kind of the smart growth movement and compact community shift that was going on at this time. And they were making the receiving areas where it's really easy to kind of create new communities where there was demand for new development, and that's what these programs look like. And we saw those emerge in Alachua, Charlotte, Lee, and Marion. Then 2005 to present, and again, this being a publication that happened in 2014, so 2005, and then for another decade, there was a focus on what I called rural TDR programs. These were rural to rural provisions where the sending area was rural, but the receiving area was also rural land. What was happening here? Well, these were typically targeted to single large land holdings, or maybe a land holding where there were a couple landowners. So the most famous and the one that was really implemented here that we'll talk more about in a moment is Collier County's Rural Land Stewardship Area approach. Some of you may be familiar with the Sarasota 2050 plan that enabled kind of the Lakewood Ranch development, which was outside of the old 75 urban line in Sarasota's rural area. And, they kind of have a lot of preservation there, and then they've got some large development. Likewise, Horizon West, if you're familiar with that in Orange County. Volusia's Farmington local plan didn't actually take off, so that was more of a plan, or I'm sorry, it's slowly being implemented, but you can see results that are less tangible than you can in the others. So this was an idea. Again, to summarize, you had rural to urban, rural fringe, and then rural to rural being the way that TDR was implemented in the state of Florida. And these align to different kind of ways that the state was responding. I'm sorry, I also didn't say in the rural approach, at that time, the state had adopted the rural land stewardship area approach. We also saw the emergence of sector planning. So the state began to look at what do we do with large land holdings in our rural areas? How do we come up with solutions? So the different ways that we've done TDR over time in Florida have definitely responded to these state policy contexts. So I told you I was going to talk about this. This is if you'll recall from one of the early slides, the top programs in the nation. Florida had 5 on there. And I just kind of myth busting, I guess, about what's going on with some of these. And there's that picture I showed you previously in the top right-hand corner. Well, they again, these programs can boast this preservation outcomes, but there's just some nuance to the story. So in Palm Beach, they have preserved a lot of land, but that came from a $100 million bond referendum. They're kind of doing what was how they kickstarted the Seattle program, public investment in open space. They severed the development rights when they purchased those environmentally sensitive lands, and they sell and bank those development rights. So they have a revolving fund. So absolutely have achieved open space protections, but it's actually public purchase of development rights. It's not that theoretical way that TDR works, where the cost is borne by the private sector. Really, this came from public bond referendum, public dollars. Collier's Rural Land Stewardship Program. This program I've got a whole slide on. This has a tremendous performance with a lot of acreage protected. This is a program targeted to large land holdings. There were 6 landowners in the original version here. This is an outcome of a state settlement, DCA. It reflects the state rural land stewardship area program. It's not really true TDR. And it has had, huge preservation outcomes as well as huge development entitlements associated with it, and has been controversial. It's a lot of folks think it's working really well. Some folks are critical of it. It's a complex one. I'm going to break it down more in a moment. But again, not typical TDR. Sarasota, most of this happened from a legal settlement. It wasn't TDR either. Miami-Dade, this is a really unique situation where you're talking about the Everglades, which has, it's huge state and national interests at play here. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers being involved. It's got a really unique dynamic. Finally, Collier Rural Fringe Mixed Use. This one, I always say, this is the only program in Florida that, in my opinion, has really worked pretty well with having real TDR. You've got private sellers selling to developers. So I'm going to break that one down as well. So we're going to look a little bit more at Collier's 2 programs, because I think these are probably the most interesting. In the rural land stewardship area one, you've got the biggest outcomes in terms of land preserved. That isn't just strict purchase of development rights like Palm Beach. And you've got Collier with the most transactions with the rural fringe mixed use area. But the takeaway when you look at this whole set of these top 5, it's only the Collier programs that didn't achieve the bulk of their protections through direct government purchase or purchase of development rights. All the rest of these reported TDR outcomes are actually not TDR, they're purchase of development rights. Collier's programs are unique products of state interventions because both of those came out of DCA lawsuits and special guidance. You've got a state framework behind them. Okay, my myth busting has begun. So here's where I'm going to kind of fast forward to 10 years later. Fish and Wildlife Foundation asked me to kind of go and say, what's now going on? Because we found some interesting trends 10 years ago in Florida, TDR. What's happening now? So I've been so fortunate to work with them, and I'm so excited because I do think that things have changed and there's some important takeaways. So phase 1, landscape level TDR programs in Florida. So I scanned all the county TDR programs as I did a decade ago. And I said, what's happening? What's the scope of activity? Are there a lot of new programs? Have some of these programs closed out? How many transactions have happened? And I'm going to break down each of these and report on each of these in just a moment. In the phase 2, I talk about county level lessons learned. So I picked a handful of case studies at the county level and looked at, okay, let me really dive deep and understand what's happened in the last 10 years by talking to folks on the ground in a couple different counties about how their TDR programs are working. And finally, in phase 3, which I'm working on now, that's a work in progress and wrapping up, I'm looking at state level policies, state frameworks, state initiatives, and how those impact and interact with TDR at the local level. This I didn't know how to present well in a slide. So I have 2 slides here, and I know they're busy, but I kind of will just try to bring attention to a few things. So I do in my reporting summarize, and this should be coming out kind of more broadly shortly because I am wrapping this up. All of the findings I have in terms of what has happened in 2012 through 2025, so those two different decades, and then total oh, sorry. So this is the most recent at TDR activity that I'm looking at, kind of this last decade of stuff since the last publications. And then this is the total if you look at what happened before kind of last recent years. So every program records TDR stuff differently. Some record how many transactions, some are, in terms of the credits that have been exchanged. Some look at how many acres have been protected. So in the rural land stewardship area, the total number of acres protected around 53,000. Excuse me, I'm going the wrong direction here. 8,000 in the rural fringe mixed use. A lot of places don't really record kind of quantified pieces on this stuff. So it's challenging to do research on this. I'll also call attention to the number of transactions. And I think, it doesn't take too much looking at this to see that not a lot's happening. Sorry, I'm bumping around too much here. And again, here's the other counties. This is kind of a two-part slide to show my whole table. The takeaway I hope that you'll see pretty clearly at a glance is not a lot happening, and not a lot happening in recent years in particular. So, in some of these cases, the difference between, what happened recently and total is not too much. So without getting too in the weeds on this, what I found when I did a scan of the scope and depth of all Florida county level TDR programs, first of all, programs do really different things. So there's really different outcomes. As the popular literature will talk about TDR as being measurable in the number of acres preserved. I don't think that's always the best measure because a lot of programs are doing really different things. Some programs are just kind of trying to close out antiquated development rights. So these are small lots and they really are a problem. And they want to kind of get rid of that dynamic, but that's never going to yield huge acreage outcomes. So TDR can work really well for those kinds of things but it's never going to look like a top performer if you're working on a smaller scale. So acreage protected is a problematic outcome, and it's really hard to look across the Florida scheme of TDR programs and say, make comparisons because of that. They do different things. So I think number two is probably one of the more important findings of phase one. There's very little activity, either new programs or transaction activity. Sorry, it's 2 and 3. So not a lot's happened. It's been a sort of a sleepy option for folks in the last decade. Why might that be? There's a lot of different theories on this. I think there's that in 2011 with the dramatic shifts in the state growth management framework. Ideally, that was, I think, supposed to kind of make development a little easier. That was the theoretical reasons for that. And I don't know that we necessarily saw a direct outcome from that. If you kind of look at permits that were taken out and how that might have changed, it could be debated about some of what happened as a result of that. But we also had COVID coming into play. We had supply chain interruptions with kind of these external factors more part of the story of maybe why we didn't see the housing production that we might have when we shifted the growth management policies. What were the factors? Why didn't things change? But that's beyond the scope of my research. I just know that very little TDR activity happened over the last decade plus. And so does this reflect housing market dynamics? Does this reflect policy shifts? Hard to exactly say. Just in the scope of this research, not a lot of activity happened is the takeaway. Can I just quickly check on the time? Okay, so in my research that was published in 2014, there was this enormous interest in rural TDR, a lot of programs in the works. Not a lot of that has been, a few of those got developed, and there's nothing new in terms of rural TDR approaches. So it was kind of a blip. It had a huge impact in some places, like the examples that I talked about with Orange County Horizons West, Sarasota, with their development outside of east of 75, and Collier's rural land stewardship area. But then a lot of these programs that were supposed to be rural land stewardship area or rural TDR never came to pass either. So that was a momentary blip, and we're not seeing that at the moment anymore. So there's two kinds of programs that do foster ongoing transaction activity. So a couple of places we do see ongoing steady transaction activity. And those have kind of these strategic density reductions. So maybe closing out some of the antiquated development rates. They're very strategic in how they just are working to reduce density in very targeted locations. They're not broad, catch-all, big, huge open space preservation strategies, targeted programs. And then otherwise, it's where there's public land acquisition that's linked to a TDR bank and a revolving fund. So this is the Palm Beach model. This is now what Sarasota is doing more of. And this is, this is the model that kickstarted the Seattle program. So I've kind of talked about that already. But again, that's important nuance because this is not strictly then a private sector carrying the burden of land protections that TDRs kind of build at. There's public land acquisition, public dollars going into that kind of program. Okay, so phase two, I did case studies on 3 different counties. I looked at Marion County, Lake County, and Collier County. In Marion County, the TDR program, and that's pictured on the top, both of these pictures are Marion County. This is designed to protect the county's farmland preservation area. That's where the horse capital of the world is located. It's an important equestrian center, and this area was, the farmland preservation area was established in 2004 in tandem with their TDR program, essentially. And the idea is to protect this rural area where you've got these equestrian agricultural activities, protect the rural lifestyle, limit growth in that area, and then transfer those development rights into places that are more appropriate to develop outside in the inside of the urban area. So I interviewed a lot of different folks in Marion County, and I came up with a couple of different things. So the community in Marion absolutely wants to protect their rural lifestyle, and they favor a lot of limitations on growth. And that can really support those sending area preservation outcomes because there is this long-term commitment to protection of the rural lifestyle. However, that feeling and that sense of kind of being careful about growth and the community kind of resisting a lot of growth and change really does have a sort of broader impact. So the board does scrutinize development proposals really carefully. The community that knows that new development is going to be controversial, carefully looked at. And so the development community says, we're going to focus really on the projects that are achieved by right. When we try to come in and have development it come in with increases, even if we're using TDR, even if we're purchasing development rights and supporting the framework, we know it's going to be scrutinized in the court of public opinion, carefully by the board, and it's hard to do. So the fact that the community does really want to protect their rural lifestyle can work in favor of the TDR program, kind of from the idea that, yeah, that sending area has got a lot of support. There is support for the rural farmland preservation area. Unfortunately, some of that sentiment kind of extends even into sort of the urban area where development rights might be received, and it's resisted. So also, landowners in that farmland preservation area don't really see sufficient value in participating in the program. Well, that's kind of a byproduct of the same dynamic. If developers aren't buying, they're not going to get those development rights purchased. Also, they talk about state purchase of development rights are a little bit easier, more efficient to do. If they want to have a land conservation and protect their land in perpetuity, they can go to the rural and family lands protection program at the state level, have a pretty simple transaction. They're not going for that sort of court of public opinion, having to find a developer to purchase those rights. That whole process is sidestepped. Finally, TDR program is seen as inequitable, and interestingly, I heard that view from a lot of different folks. But essentially, the sort of magic of TDR is, hey, the public sector gets to see all these conservation benefits and we don't have to put money into it because in theory, the developers are buying those development rights. Well, those developers are saying, we don't want to buy those. That's not fair that we've got to bear the cost of this community's vision of how it wants to achieve preservation. So there are and a lot of folks feel that way even beyond the development community, there's a perception that these programs can be inequitable. I heard that in Marion County. Lake County is an interesting case study. I don't have images to go with that, I'm sorry, but because that's one that's in development. So they do have an existing TDR program. It's had very limited participation. In a way, it kind of related to some state actions that are now a couple decades old in a very small area. They're now looking at they've got a lot of the same pressures as Marion. The community really wants to have protect a rural lifestyle. They really want to preserve some open space and conservation areas. And they are looking at a regional model because they've got a lot of smaller local governments for how to do that. So in the report that again, it will be out soon and all can have access to it, I kind of talk about that there's a lot of challenges with that. There's challenges about inequities, and that one's more at sort of like who bears costs and burdens of this program when you talk about a regional model in terms of all the different local government partnerships. Um, there are concerns from the home builders and the developers in the area that there's just not a marketplace for higher density. So that's a dynamic that I've talked about as well. So I'm not going to spend too much more time in the interest of time. And then Collier County, let me break that out. But those are the two different versions of like real CDR success in the state. And I'll talk about that. So the rural land stewardship area, this is almost 13% of Collier County. It's almost 200,000 acre area. If any of you are familiar with it, it's really the signature kind of development there is the Ave Maria, town of Ave Maria, and that's what's pictured here. So there's a long range vision for a lot of land preservation. 92,000 acres of conservation, 40,000 acres of citrus and crops, and then a maximum of 45,000 acres of new town and village development. So to not get too in the weeds on this one, 200,000 acres, only 45,000 acres developed. The rest of it in some kind of conservation uses. It's a really impactful and dramatic vision, and there's a really special toolkit to achieve this. And again, this comes out of a state level kind of intervention and a state level program. So this is this, and it has been progressing, and there's outcomes with it that have gone on over the over I think about 2 decades since this has a little over 2 decades now since this came out. So this is sometimes identified as Florida's best performing TDR program in terms of those acres preserved, but it's not really TDR. This is special development provisions for a couple large landowners, and originally I believe there were four. I think there's a few more at this point. But basically, in exchange for them protecting some open space, they do get these new development provisions in places like the town of Ave Maria, the towns and villages that are allowed in here. So it's a very unique situation. It's not TDR. There's no private seller selling their development rights to a private purchaser. So this has landscape level conservation, and there's important lessons for that. There's real stewardship achievements. There's also controversial amounts of new development, but there are lessons to be taken from here. I just don't think they're TDR lessons. The Rural Fringe Mixed Use Program is also really interesting. This is the kind of urban rural fringe of Collier County. It's a totally different program. It covers 77,000 acres. Oh, I wish I'd put the stat in here. This one has hundreds of different landowners. It's got a fragmented ownership landscape. And this one is the most important TDR program in Florida in terms of it's got the true TDR, private sellers of development rights, private purchasers of development rights. They have had 161 transactions. I'm sorry that I keep doing that. I'm getting too excited with my mouse here. And then almost 8,000 acres preserved. So this one, there are lessons to be drawn from this because this one seems to actually have market viability for private transfers. It's the highest performing program in the state of Florida for that. But I also want to emphasize only, depends on your perspective, 7,824 acres have been protected, and this is about 2 decades old. So is this the right kind of bang for the buck? If you operate in this world, TDR programs are very intensive in terms of resources, management, political, processes. So this is the most successful one, and it's important to look at. And TDR can work. This is the living proof, but in Florida, but there's a lot of nuance here. And again, this one had a state level intervention kind of as part of how it works this way. Finally, and I do want to leave time for questions. I'm trying not to rush, but I don't want to take too long. I'm going to talk about phase 3, which is the state initiatives, policies, outcomes, projects, etc., and how those interact with local TDR. So the first thing that is important to note is Shands versus Marathon. Just in June of this year, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to the writ of certiorari for review of this case. So there's an important TDR case that even had the U.S. Supreme Court's look at it. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear it. So the third DCA ruling on this case stands. I don't want to get too in the weeds on this because this is kind of some legal nuances here. But what this case did, and it's the bolded sentence here that's important to understand, is this case positions TDR as generally insufficient to avoid a total takings claim. So if you're going to take all beneficial use off of a property, you can't say, if you're taking away all ability to develop from a property after Shands versus Marathon, you can't say, but they have TDR. So if you say you're entitled to 1 unit per acre, but I'm not going to get too in the weeds on this, but if you take away all a bit of opportunity to use that property, but do give TDR, that's not going to fly. You've got to TDR is instead going to be viewed only in compensation, not to mitigate for takings. That's the important takeaway for this case. The good news is most Florida TDR programs are voluntary and they enable landowners to continue with their uses, agricultural, limited residential uses. So the Shands ruling has little practical impact. Hugely impactful in Monroe County, in the Florida Keys, and I hope to kind of continue looking into what they're going to be doing there because there are good reasons that you can't develop on a lot of the barrier islands down there, and who should bear the burden of those costs, and how are state and local policies working to do that, to look at hurricane evacuation. So this will be an important case for that area, a little bit less so for the rest of the state of Florida, but certainly makes a strong position around TDR and will probably influence at the national level regulatory takings doctrine and certainly TDR. Again, I don't want to get too in the weeds about this, but one of the concerns with this case is that sort of legislating from the judicial branch, because they're saying 1 acre here TDR wasn't enough. Who's going to draw these lines? I don't want to get too in the weeds, but there's some concerns about the long-term impacts of this. Okay, so I think a little bit more importantly and a little more tangible for this community, since the outcome of Shands versus Marathon's limited in Florida, are all the legislative actions that have been happening in the state of Florida. So I'm listing a few of those. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with a lot of these, but there's definitely an overall kind of policy arc going on in the state of Florida. And these are, in summary, I think, favoring state preemption. They're saying we want to limit local roadblocks to growth. There's an encouragement of administrative review processes instead of that sort of court of public opinion where there are opportunities for the public to kind of make more of a stand around how they feel about growth and development, but the state is concerned about that. And a lot of these programs are focused on enabling residential development. So I think, what do I want to especially call attention to? I think where you see some of this and the most obvious outcomes for TDR are in the agricultural enclaves legislation, where basically it can be in rural areas, but if land is surrounded or has proximity to other kind of more intensive forms of development, like suburban forms of development, now those landowners can develop even if the local rules say otherwise. And so there's a state preemption there, and that affects rural lands. It's a very particular set of rules that applies to, and that will sunset, I think, it's got a sunset of 18 months, and it was launched in July 2026. So we also see with House Bill 399 that was passed. It had very interesting and controversial provisions that would kind of impact urban growth boundaries. And urban growth, that ultimately was stripped from that legislation that was passed, but the legislature continues to look at urban growth boundaries and whether they want to kind of do something about that. Because again, that's a roadblock at the local level to growth. It can limit the enablement of residential development. urban growth boundaries are really important to the way TDR programs work. So I think that that's, again, going to be a factor if that continues to be looked at. I'm going to also call attention to blue ribbon projects. This is a facilitating development in rural areas. And then there's a movement towards revisiting Chapter 163, state land use policy in general, promotion of administrative approval of a lot of development. This is the policy context that local governments are working within. This is where the state's shifting. So these are all things that are going to make TDR a little less effective. It'll take the wind out of the sails, I think, of a lot of TDR programs, because essentially, in summary, a lot of this is going to allow development in rural areas. And because TDR is trying to usually kind of limit that development or create incentives where someone has to purchase the right to development, all these ways that will be enabled more are going to remove that market. Finally, payment programs. So the big one here is the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program. That program has had just unprecedented successes in recent years, with a huge increase in funding, a huge increase in applications, a huge increase in land preservation outcomes. So this is, a takeaway I got was really when I talked to Marion County folks, the large landowners say, we're just going to go to that program. We don't need to go to the local TDR programs if we want to conserve our land. And there's just such a momentum around this program that I think it's really game changing for conservation in the state of Florida. So that's huge. That's really changing the direction of how rural, agricultural, and open space can be protected. The vision around there is not direct public purchase, but one of conservation easements. So how do we kind of look at what's going on there and create good conservation programs with that in mind? Also, the Florida Wildlife Corridor is piloting a payment for ecosystem services program. Again, this is like where there's direct purchase to the landowners. It's real easy, really streamlined for them to be able to keep their land in conservation and open space. They're just closed their application process for the Avon Park Air Force Sentinel Landscape Area pilot program on this. This is smaller, but they see this program as a pathway to participate in the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program. So I think things are really aligning to where the lesson on my phase 3 piece, or this one at least, is there's galvanizing kind of support for conservation, and it's coming in through these protect payment kinds of programs that bypass complicated local political processes and support economic development, because they're supporting agriculture and other activities, ecosystem services. So in summary, there's not too much TDR activity over the last 10 years, and even in total in Florida. Where you see it, it's pretty selective of few programs that have really unique situations. And in particular, Collier's RLSA and RFMU programs are really important. One for being the most acres preserved, but it's not really TDR, that's the RLSA, and one for having the most market-based transaction activity, that's the RFMU and RFMUD. Different people call it different things. But those are really instructive cases. So folks interested in sort of large landscape level conservation outcomes, I think there's good lessons in the RLSA program. Those who want to use TDR to support sort of more strategic market-based TDR, RFMU is the one to look at for that. The overall state actions and initiatives really do kind of undermine local TDR programs. I feel like I don't want to mince words. That's not where the state direction is going. The concerns around developers needing to purchase development rights, having to go through local roadblocks, that's not where state policy is going. And I think TDR isn't going to work as well in that policy context. So I think that if you're interested in conservation, if you are a local government, you want to have rural and open space protections, you're going to have to prioritize conservation strategies that better align with that policy trend. And I think there's a lot of hope in that policy trend. I think the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program and the unprecedented support there is really important. And that's where we need to kind of put our efforts as a community interested in conservation. And there's anticipated reforms in state growth management rules. How can the conservation community come together and say, hey, there's a lot of stuff here about prioritizing development, but there's some place where you've got to draw a line, and we're going to come together and kind of help tell that story and influence that state reform process. So I think that's going to be an important takeaway. And so where to go next? I just want to emphasize that my findings are not applicable to city and urban TDR programs. I think absolutely continue to support and enhance existing county TDR programs, but I wouldn't put a lot of effort into creating new ones personally based on the state policy context. And the important thing would be to link local conservation initiatives to the important kind of state priorities and state initiatives like the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program and the Florida Wildlife Corridor Program. I hope I didn't go too terribly long. That is my contact info. So please feel free to reach out if you'd like any more information. And I welcome your questions.
All righty. Thank you so much, Van, for that insightful presentation. We can go ahead and open the floor for questions. You're welcome to either unmute yourself or type your questions into the chat box, and we've got a couple waiting. The first question is, this seems to promote urban sprawl and habitat fragmentation, which undermine conservation. Can you speak on this?
Well, I hope you don't think I'm promoting that. To me, the state policy context does raise some alarm bells where things seem to be shifting because it is so oriented towards housing provision and opening up rural areas to do that. So I do feel like that is concerning. And I think the resistance to the blue ribbon projects legislation that ultimately was not successful and didn't get support is really telling here. I think that when the community kind of said, hey, we all really support housing, we all really support, where can we kind of make the process make a little more streamlined, but you've got to be able to draw a line. I think I think that there was successful resistance to that Blue Ribbons project piece. I think things like that are going to continue to bubble up, but those folks interested in conservation are going to have to say, where do we draw the line? And I think leveraging the strong support for the interest in agriculture, the strong support for the Florida Wildlife Corridor might be the best hope for that. So the things that those programs are oriented towards protecting, like water resources and like wildlife, that's better aligns with the state story and can help prevent sprawl if we can create programs that speak to that.
What is the relationship of TDRs with mitigation banks?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you for it. And the last question also super important in what's going on. But I think that that's going to be looked at because mitigation banks have probably been a little bit more successful, but they have the same underlying principles of moving, pieces across landscapes to kind of better solve ecological issues, using incentives. These can happen at the state level. So I think there will be a continued kind of interest in looking at mitigation banking and how it works and seeing if there's a way to kind of unite TDR with that. I think what's tricky about TDR and honestly, mitigation banking has a lot of these things. If I think the folks in this room will all attest to that. You're really talking about very specific locations that either have ecosystem functions or market functions, and it can be hard to create consensus around how to move those places around, those parts around, and get the desired outcomes. So I think it's tricky, but I think it will be where innovation will happen.
All righty. And then we are wondering about creating density increases in receiving areas. And to do that, we wonder about increasing the density of credits available from a sending area the local government has acquired to create the initial bank of credits. Are there rules against a local jurisdiction increasing its density in a sending area while restricting density increases in a receiving area to force the market to buy from the local government bank development rights?
So obviously I'd have to really understand that specific case and every place is different, but in general that's exactly what TDR programs do. So generally I think that's fine. In Florida we have a really strong property rights protection framework, and so there's a lot of um, limitations on down zoning. So in the sending areas, TDR's usually got to be voluntary, and it's really tricky to down zone. Receiving areas where you have or might be promoting development, in my experience, there's typically very few limitations besides things like FAA, on increasing density, increasing the rights to development. I think local governments typically have a lot of wiggle room there. So in general, that is the strategy that TDR uses and can work.
Alrighty. Those were the questions that were in the chat. Let me check the Q&A. That doesn't have any additional ones. So, oh, one just popped in. Can we get a copy of these slides? I do post this video to our site, but if there's an additional way to get a copy of these slides, Van did put her info on the previous slide. The rest of the question says, the county commissioner I work for on our TDC needs to incorporate the main takeaways to regularly large groups of residents that show up at BOCC meetings and are angry, vocal, and completely unaware of how our state is postured on these crucial issues.
Well, my email is up there and I am happy to share my slides. And also if you email me and you want the slides from today, and you could also let me know if you'd like the whole report, which will be forthcoming within the next month, that I've been doing for Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. And I know that their interest is in disseminating this. So I can add you to that list to distribute that when that's ready. If you indicate that that's what you'd also like, happy to do that.
I usually send out a follow-up email after these, after we get the video posted to our website. If it's okay with you, could I put your contact information at the bottom of that email to everyone?
Yeah, sure.
Just in case they want to reach out? Okay, I can do that. All right, and then another one popped up. Are there any highlights of ambitious county conversation program, or sorry, yeah, conversation programs from the country that you think can be implemented by us in Florida?
Oh, um, really, I like to study Florida, and that's where I'm the most fluent. But even with it, as much as I hope that this wasn't too much of a downer presentation, there's interesting stuff happening in Florida. Newport Richey is using TDR in a really innovative way to protect their coastal areas and to promote downtown redevelopment. It's the Collier Rural Fringe Mixed Use and the Collier RLSA that I think have interesting lessons. I think moving forward, we'd have to rework some of those in light of the current policy context, but I think those have interesting lessons. I really want to say that I chose Lake and Marion because I think they are among the most interesting in the state of Florida as well. Lake is trying to do something totally innovative where they're using really cool modeling to think about how they're going to protect their most important rural resources. They're looking at TDR as a potential tool for that, but I think they're open to whatever, works there. And the fact that they're doing intergovernmental coordination to achieve that is important. And then Marion with a huge farmland preservation area that has really committed support from commissioners and the community. I think it hasn't worked as they've wanted, and they're going to be needing to tweak it. There's been some really cool work. I think Stantec, in partnership with that local government, just updated their comp plan and is working on some tweaks to that. So those are the ones I would watch.
Righty. Let me make sure no other questions popped up. That seems to be it. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Van, for joining us today. And next month, we're going to have Keeping Eyes on Our Ecosystems, Invasive Species Recon Teams with Species Survey Coordinator Christian Wanamaker. If you have any questions or want to present something on our webinar in the future, please email us at Office of Greenways and Trails at floridadep.gov. And like I said, I'll include a link to this video as well as Dr. Linkous's email in the email that I send out to you guys. So thanks again, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you. Bye.